Okay, Paul Del Gallo, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing today, Eric?
I'm doing very well. I appreciate you coming on. Just for anybody who's watching, Paul Del Gallo is one of the more clever business strategy minds I've met. He's currently the managing director at Firstsight. What do you want your Chiron to say when I put it up?
I mean, we usually say things like managing member or manager, but I mean, I run the joint is usually what I put if I don't put it on a card.
And the firm is called Firstsight Group.
Firstsight Group. That's correct.
Group. Okay. Well, welcome. And for the people who are just listening at home, Paul is wearing a banana costume. Just joking.
This is the only big shirt I have available.
I'm never sure how, is this a radio show? Like, do we need to say, here's a message from our sponsors. Hey, Paul, what do you do when you walk into your restroom and there's no men's hair cream?
I am the wrong choice for that endorsement, but I hear from others that it's always great because it's like, as you sit here, and of course, I don't have a lot of background in this, you think, what if I mention a brand name that I don't really have an authorization to mention? And I was like, what if somebody could chase me down and go, we heard you said something great about our company today. We would like to have a word with you.
This podcast is brought to you by Shine Bright Hair and Beard Wax for Andy Gentlemen. If you don't use Shine Bright, the ladies will hate you. How's that?
Like we're driving down the road and there's a series of signs going past us, right?
Right. So one of the things we've been talking about, and I think this is kind of an interesting direction to go in, is the stuff that's going on with ESG, which was formerly known as CSR or EPR. It had a lot of incarnations, and I know they're now trying to rebrand ESG as something else because it's being tossed around as a sort of a slur if you ask like a Larry Fink and so on. But one of the articles that came up in the news was that Lego has announced they're discontinuing their recycled Lego bricks because it wasn't resulting in a reduction in carbon emissions. I'm curious what you think about that.
So, it's interesting because like most of the work that we do, this is more about reputation than fact, right? So it's all about the imagery and emotion that comes into the behavioral economics. And when you look at what the original goal was in changing the plastic that's being used in Legos, the current concern that they brought to it is they have clutching power questions. So whether they can get enough of it, whether it can grip it. But really, it was a result of a lot of pressure. Particularly, it's a company out of Denmark, and in the European Union, they'd made a commitment to make a change. And philosophically, and in perception, and in reputation, a more practical view has arisen. So when we look at the plastics used in Lego, we're not looking at a fuel source. So it's not a matter of the underlying petroleum-based products are being pumped and used to run cars. But then the second part of it is that we know from another client that we have that the number of recycled bottles that are available and used for this sort of thing is very low. And then the last, there's a nice, robust debate whether 5 or 10% are truly recycled. But when you're really looking at, am I solving the problem, that's not really an important point of it. And I think an interesting part of this is that that's where sort of some reality started entering the discussion. What is really the point of making this conversion? Will it change the product? Will it change the brand? And I think to get there, in my opinion, you have to understand Lego. Now, Lego has never been a client of mine. We have a lot of Fortune 500 clients. They're a private firm. But I've always admired them because reputationally and in brand, they are truly unique and remarkable. And I'm sure we all know, and we all have very strong feelings about this brand, which is one of the ways you have a great brand, right? When people think of this kind of product, that's the name marker. So it started, just after World War II. It's well known originally for being just a set of construction blocks, but there are others that exist, Duplo and others. But the real key is that Lego grew into a brand far beyond that. So, for example, if you think about functionally what it needs to do, it only needs to have a bunch of pieces that you can put together to represent something. And when I was younger, and I'm a little bit older than you, we literally just played with Lego blocks. You would get a platform and you'd build on it, and it came upon the kid's imagination. And the name itself actually was something like Play Well. And it's really an interesting kind of mindset. And this became a bedrock sort of childhood toy, for lack, but over time it's become an entire brand. It's eclipsed all of the other toy brands, and it's done so on its reputation. So now, there's a funny thing that happens, which is when anybody debates what's the best Batman, is it Michael Keaton or whatever, one of the ones they always have to mention is the Lego Batman. So it literally absorbs brands, and it's an incredible thing because when you look at most tie-ins, that's not true. And they have movies, and they have, for a long time, become sort of the way you knew you arrived, sort of Madame Tussauds when it talks about a wax figure, right? They debate about whether they're happy with it, but there's no debate. I've arrived. I have this. When Star Wars becomes the Millennium Falcon that you get, and when Ed Sheeran says, I finally had enough money to pay for that kind of ridiculously priced Lego set, that's huge. How does this all come back to ESG and all of this? Well, that's huge pressure on that now to address overpendulum, however you care to say it, and you have 100 phrases I've heard you use, sort of when we have gotten to the point where we're looking at things and going, it's an admirable cause, but in order to just show something, to make a demonstration, we were doing something like melting plastic bottles that weren't going to work out. Now the real question has become, what are other ways they can do this? So one of the things they've mentioned is they're going to use paper bags as opposed to plastic bags to hold the parts. And for people who really sort of in their head can picture how many Legos are in this galaxy, that's a significant number. If you've stepped on a Lego, you've had a kid, right? So this is something we all really get. But we got to kind of turn to, well, what changed between, say, 2 years ago and today? Because it's not the commitment with the EU. It is the recognition that a lot of these over-exaggerations, non-practical solutions don't match Lego as a brand. Lego's an incredibly practical brand. You really can just go and build a construction site, or again, this enormous thing, and there's a lot to it. And when you're picking at something that has its source, that's not consistent, reliable supply chain, that it's really, their analysis was that it wasn't going to save much in energy. I feel confident, speaking for them, having never met them, that they probably knew that all along. But there was no longer a need to dress it up. And I think this is going to start reflecting in a lot of brands and a lot of actions that have taken place over the last 5 or 10 years, where symbolic moves that have no practicality underneath them are going to fade out. And I believe that to be the case.
It seems like, I know we always present, you've got the market forces that are surrounded by the beyond market forces, which are shaping them. But often we don't think of them as tensions between the two. They're more like complementary pressures. But this one seems like, nobody buying, no, I won't say that, but like the Lego market isn't saying we want recycled bricks to reduce your carbon footprint. And it's the same thing when we look at private equity firms. What can they offer to founders? And the founders say, we need help building a sales engine, and we need industry experience as your private equity platform. And the private equity people are saying, are you sure you don't want ESG advice? And are you sure you don't want, no, sure. The founders say, no, we don't want that. So it's that tension between like, how do you respond to what the market's saying they want? And especially because Lego's got competitors now from the generic side. So like they have some pricing pressure, not on movies and stuff, but on the bricks themselves. So
and I think you bring up a great point, because there's a lot of behavioral economics underneath this, right? When you think of, as we say, on the movie side, they're not going to get there. And when you look at their competitor field like Hasbro and others, they're dropping in sales coming out of COVID, and Legos continues to go up. And that's because they make, for a better way to say it is they make more than a toy.
Yeah.
But when you look at these private equity support groups that you're talking about that bring in, as you mentioned, you're looking for capital, a sales pipeline, expertise in and out of the segment, et cetera. And they're saying, well, what we'd really like to bring to the table are these, again, non-results related endeavors, right? So I don't want to put any of these things down, but say nobody has on the same day woken up and said, I implemented ESG and then we doubled profits, right? It's a different issue. You're managing reputation. The question that has come to rise is, if I'm convincing a budding company to use my investment in them badly, what's gone wrong here? And the answer is, it's really behavioral economics. If I take the power that comes with money in an investment process, and I convince a growing firm to make symbolic moves that are either A, neutral, or B, at least a distraction where have I arrived. And I don't think it takes a lot for anybody to look onto the landscape right now, as we do every day, and say, if you are competing very intently in the movie industry right now, for example, as we talked about, where it has gotten a big question, what's streaming, what's not, you say what we need the most is an increased level of diversity and equity. The question you have to ask yourself, is that a means to an end or ends in itself? We saw with Snow White when they came forward and said, this is the way we're going to do Snow White, had a horrible backlash. Probably not particularly related to some of the more traditional reasons people get upset about that, but a sense that, well, are you improving the story or are you just making a point? And this has become a common conversation point. And the way I always try to describe it is there's always in these second round events a level of imitation. So one of my favorite comparisons is Ponzi schemes and insider trading. Right. So, I mean, this is a Paul special. You can only come up with this sort of thing when you think the way we do. Ponzi schemes came along about the same time as insider trading. If you don't know, insider trading was legal for a long period of time until they formed the SEC and said, we're going to make this illegal and prosecute it. You could openly say, I knew the CEO and he said X, Y, and Z. And you could also mislead markets your own end. Concurrent with that are Ponzi schemes. And so this is a guy, as an Italian-American, I'll tell you, not one of our best, who went out and said, I'll sell you shares, you'll sell further shares, and we'll keep churning money through. And the reason those two things happened at the same time was, as the telephone came out and people started investing in stocks, not by walking to literally Wall Street, but actually communicating that way, everybody became aware that there was this insider trading. And so when you go next layer down in society, people who didn't have impact on governmental agencies, impact on access to large amounts of capital, they were well aware that the game was rigged and they wanted their opportunity to be part of that. And of course, so what happens really is everybody lost all their money. The depression broke out. If you were in the Ponzi schemes, you lost your money. If you're in the stock market, you lost your money and everything else. But there is so you come to the question of, how am I comparing myself? Am I comparing Legos and what they put inside of it to what a private equity firm tells me is the benchmark, what the market tells me is the benchmark, or what I've set for it? And is this helping me get it from A to B? Wonderfully easy conversation to have, incredibly difficult. And I think that where I'm going with all of this is very much like the Ponzi schemes or the insider trading. A lot of these external dressages, sort of these things that they're putting on, are going to collapse. And you're really going to see people go, I'm going to comply with the law. I'm going to do the right thing, but I'm not going to try to inure the brand reputation of my company through this. Recently, I saw, and I didn't get a chance to dig into it, but there was a lawsuit from an employee at Starbucks who had been, I believe they were in Philadelphia, and this was one of the huge initial openings that are rounds of it, where I believe she was a lady. She had asked these gentlemen to leave and then called the police. And of course, looks horrible, right? Looks like this is it. This is the Karen of the Year award. And what she was actually doing is following the procedure book right to the letter. And so time goes by, and first we vilify her, and then nobody really pieces together, well, the villain here is Starbucks, right? This poor person was just doing their job as described. And then Starbucks said, we're going to let anybody sit wherever they want in our stores. And they turned into libraries. You know, I mean, it was just one of these, there was no reason to make a purchase. And so they eventually reversed off of that. And then you get to some of the Starbucks have unionized. So employees are pushing back in these leverages. Where am I going with all of this? Just recently, I've seen two things happen. I don't happen to go to Starbucks much, but I was shopping in a store and I had a coupon. So I said to the lady behind there, the famous baristas, I said, what do you have that's hot, tall, and sweet? And she said, I don't know. I only eat the black coffee. She literally didn't know. And I was like, the only thing I knew about Starbucks is these baristas were supposed to be these people who would, like, based upon my inquiry, would know how to, like, make some great. She was like, I don't really know. I only drink black coffee. I was like, how are you here today, right? This is like a vegetarian running a McDonald's. But if you go to the other end of it, the woman who ran that Starbucks won a massive jury award, properly suing for defamation and a variety of other things. Because if you go onto the job market and they say, well, how did your last job end? You see, you probably saw it on the news. I was the lady throwing those young black gentlemen out with the police. I mean, it was truly defamatory, truly loss of it. So as you can imagine, where we're at now is that while we see those things vividly in as short messages, broadly you see groups going, I don't need to make any of these things, whether it is the environmental questions or anything else, my number one priority. They are means to an end, not the ends themselves. Does this make sense? Does this fall into a...
It makes sense to me. Like the DEI and belongingness stuff, in a consultancy, those are natural complements. That makes for, diversity makes for a stronger consultancy. But I can see, like, for some of the ESG goals, they're directly at odds. So, like, let's say, so you have private equity. They're pushing you to at least signal that you're making these changes. Let's say that that they'll back you up if there's any blowback. So it's like, let's say, you're Budweiser or something, and you're going to be backed up. Is it better to lose your market, or is it better to lose your investors in the long term if you're a shareholder, a major shareholder, or a CEO?
It's a fantastic question. I mean, in people debate this a great deal. I know my opinion's on it very strong. If you follow the lead of your investors in the tactical space, right? In the tactical space, you will close. They will close you for you. Investors have incredibly bad ideas. They form Ponzi schemes and they form insider trading. They go, I really know how to manage this. And I'll give you an example. So let's step away from private equity and turn to a publicly traded firm. Coca-Cola came out and said, we are going to make sure that a large percentage of our legal costs are handled by Black associates, right? Well, there's no economic sense to that. As a matter of fact, it's an automatic weak spot because you are signaling to the legal environment, hey, you might be in front of a lawyer who was picked for other reasons. Whereas if you go to sort of the broader category and go, I'm going to win through diversity, that's absolutely a positive way to go. There's money in those hills. I don't know how else to say it, right? There's just money in those hills. If you arrive at a meeting and you're a consultant and you're in front of, say, Hoya, and nobody in the room has ever eaten any of those food products or speaks that language or knows how to appeal to that market, you're done. If you show up with the pride of Norway, 45 white guys, and you're done, and ought to be, because you lack a market insight. So when I ask, do I want to have the market of the investors? I don't know how to say this politely, right? But I can always find another investor. The investors exist. They will sit there. There are plenty out there who are driven by and using DEI and these other things as a mean to an end. Markets are very hard to get. If you talk to anybody in sales and marketing, there's a lot of big talk, but actually landing them and putting them to vote is incredibly hard. So I believe you should worry about what your market does. Now, corporate governance mandates that you do meet the benchmarks of conduct, right? So if your investors come in and say, and this is where it gets really complicated, we have a zero tolerance policy for anything that even looks like sexual harassment or assault. You can't go, yeah, but I'm still finding great markets out there, right? I mean, that's unacceptable. But when you step away from the things that are breaches of law, breaches of regulation, breaches of accepted societal law conduct, it's easier to find an investor than it is a market. Markets are very hard.
So I think you're getting at, like, it all changes as soon as you got this triad of sort of private consumers, private companies, and public governance. And it all changes once public governance has been linked to the private company, because they can limit you. So the only reason why you lose markets is they have someplace to go. So if we talk about something like school lunches, nobody has an alternative to school lunches because that's a school lunch program. So there's not a lot of incentive to reform. I wonder if that's the natural evolution of the investors achieving their ESG goals, is bringing in governments to sort of help shape what private companies can do in response to them.
I agree, if you don't mind me kind of jumping off, but I also think that it involves academia, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where the real weak point comes in. So the governmental institutions, so if we're going to talk about school lunches, we have a lot of clients without getting the names of them, if they're big in food, I've had them as a client or currently have them as a client, right? And then, by the way, there's a lot of fun in those clients, right? They do interesting things. But when you look at something like school lunches, there's no way you're going to arrive at a school lunch question without local school districts, food programs, but as well like USDA, SNAP, all of those. But what's driving that and working through that is academic research, right? And academic research 5 or 10 years ago would be around what is the best meal plate for a child at the age of 12 who is in school and helps them the most. And we'd have all of these things that would come back and say, breakfast programs, greatly improved brain power, which I always found to be the most interesting academic study because I wasn't quite sure I'm not a scientist like you, and I didn't know what the definition of brain power was, but I knew whatever the definition was, it wasn't named brain power, right? That there was some actual scientific thing. With that said and done, academia, it was you that brought to my attention JPA Iodinice, this Greek gentleman who now teaches at Stanford in like 2005, did a fantastic paper called Why Most Research Papers Are Wrong. And what it really proved out was that if you look at how they were drawing conclusions in academia, originally, without ill intent, it was the wrong methodology. There was a great disposition to do affirming research of the professor before you, or very candidly, and again, it's so hard because to turn to any of the PhDs who work with us and go, as a lot of PhD students would do, they'll find something that they know the results won't match what they think the professor will like. Yeah. Well, when we take that academic part, and we'll talk a little bit about what's happening recently. So the USDA has to decide what to do with school lunches, which then decides how my clients do. They aren't going to, the USDA it's one of the worst, they have some labs, right? The FDA has some labs, but most of them require that this be brought to them, that there's independent research that supports having more chickpeas and less, white flour, right? But that really comes from other academic research that's sponsored. And a lot of this academic research in the last 5 years and the last 5 weeks has gotten really questioned. There's a question about whether corporations are driving the research, whether the research is in the public interest, is a huge area. Going back to JPA Iodinice again and saying, how am I getting these incorrect findings, these false results? And one of the answers is that the motivation, the underlying driver isn't arising academically, but externally, right? And we first started seeing this. There was a group out there, the Wangzink Food Group, who's doing the food industry research at Carnegie Mellon, I think. Anyway, I haven't seen this one. The Brian Wangzink stuff. He was doing. If you call it biotechnology, that's better than calling it genetically modified. If you make snack packs, people eat less, and so on. And then it turned out he was fudging some of the research. No, I haven't seen this one. This is really the problem, though. This is really the question. When you asked earlier, but I insert government to add to the control because we know from insider trading, we know from Ponzi schemes that unfortunately, even those of us who believe in free markets go, well, you do have to have some way in some extremities to stop it and give everybody full research. Well, the answer becomes, I'm getting research from a person who's thinking this will be hilarious. I'll just say this is the outcome. And the controls in an academic environment to prevent academic dishonesty are extraordinarily poor. People in business look over at that and we go, are you kidding? Right? Because if you want to get a check for a $40 lunch out of a property casualty insurance company, there's at least 3 humans reviewing your invoice. Recently, it was found that common brain scan that we all see, or as you're describing, it turned out to be made up. Yeah. Because there's like almost no control system where somebody comes in and peer-reviewed, that's what Iodinice was bringing up, peer-reviewed research. It's like, kinda, right? But why and where's it taking you? And so this is where we find ourselves, which is going, all right, so let me postulate something. Now in the last few weeks, now there's a huge problem because there's 3 things that universities are in the business of. And again, I struggle to say this to PhDs because it's like telling people at a food company how to cook things. But there are 3 external things that they do. Number 1, they're worried about donors, right? They need money to run, and nobody denies it. Number 2, they need graduates, right? And number 3, they need those graduates to go to good jobs. If they lose any one of those 3 legs on the stool, it falls over, right? There's other things they can get caught up in as they really have unbelievable controversies. I watched as a Yale professor and administrator lost their jobs with tenure because they sent a note that in the best light was in poor taste about Halloween costumes. They said, maybe we can think about relaxing a little bit. And there were people like, people the age of my kids, 19, going, you have to leave this university. That's not just political. There's an undertone of that is what happens. So now the new question, and this really is that spike through, is if I can't trust academic research. There was a group that we were just talking about, I think you brought them to my attention as well, called No Free Lunch. These were medical students who refused to be in professors who were being sponsored. That was all the way down to even if they just get lunch from an organization. It went from that to just free for all. Well, once the control system comes off of academics, I'm not a consultant in the academic world. So I'm not trying to fix that, but the new question arises, which is, where do I get the research to support the societal interest? And how is that controlled? And I believe that's really going to be what happens next. You'll have folks go, I don't need to go to get an undergraduate degree from a tier 3 school in learning about myself and others, which, reading a bunch of unsupported research to then have there's no practicality to it. Instead, what I think will start happening, or I'm hopeful will happen, and I believe actually will, is that research institutes will start separating from academic institutes, but won't turn into the thing that they were before. So there was a period of time where, tobacco would assemble a research institute that would come to the table and say, we've determined that cigarette smoking reduces Alzheimer's, right? And you sit there and go, boy, you want to talk about, but there would be a very interesting outcome, which is that instead of sponsoring academic institutions, some of these donations started going to research organizations that then would be used. So if you were at a school and you said, I want to look into cancer research, and Dana-Farber is already running fantastic research, maybe instead of using my grant at the academic institution, I'll use it at Dana-Farber to provide the research free to the academic institution. And all of this sounds convoluted. We always talk about these things aren't a switch where we go one day, all of these things are overdone and then they're gone. But instead it's sort of a spear of issues that are pressing down. And to understand it's looking like it's like looking at a jigsaw puzzle from behind, right? So you have to assemble a jigsaw puzzle, but you can't see the picture. And that's what I think is going to take place.
It's strange because one of the core competencies that's central to academia is at least the appearance of independence. And I know that when I went in, I was like, oh, cool, I can do research that is detached from having to have any sort of agendas or societal pressures. And I feel like, if you're independently wealthy and you also own your own journal that you can publish your own articles in, maybe you could pull that off, or maybe your research doesn't cost any money. But I always strived to not take government funding because most of my friends went into the private sector, and like the idea that they would use the barrel of a gun to coerce me to pay for their product, would have been laughable to them. So I always tried not to. But at least with the government funding, you just have to lie at the beginning and say, this is going to help solve, in 2001, it was terrorism. And we're going to make super soldiers. And then we're going to solve racism. No, now it's going to solve global warming or climate change or something. Right. And then you do whatever research you're going to do and then report back and spin it to whatever. But like in the private sector, you're beholden to outcomes, and they start with the outcomes. So it makes me concerned about accepting private funding, I think even more than public funding. I'm curious, like if universities are going to be able to weather, like now that it's the cat's out of the bag and people are seeing, okay, universities have conflicts of interest that interfere with their pure, objective impartiality. Without that core competency, where does that even leave the university system?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's uncomfortable to answer.
Yeah.
There was a period of time before and after Enron, and again, before and after Ponzi schemes, and I like bringing up Ponzi schemes because nobody participated in them is personally alive today. Whereas if you go to Enron, like for the record, you and I are both Northwestern graduates. The central folks in the Enron scandal were from the Kellogg School of Management.
Yeah.
If you didn't know, let's make sure we record that, right? So, but when you look at those things, there was a core period of time where significant and massive change took place in the way that we administered and ensured that controls were in place in business. Now, they didn't solve everything. They didn't come close to solve everything. People will, business hates a vacuum. So once we created a large control system over these companies, people came up with cryptocurrencies and ways to get around things. But prior to Enron and then therefore Sarbanes-Oxley, in publicly traded organizations that had its size in half, it was the wild, wild west. And I was working in them. I spent 18 years running an audit department. And so you look at the control structure, and we were all telling the truth. I mean, I say this, we would go in a room and ask people, hey, look, it's one thing if the number's wrong. It's another thing if you're like, I'm glad the number's wrong, right? This is one of the common speeches we give. And we'd explain why that won't work out. I believe that, comfortably that most were producing the correct answers, following the rules, and couldn't tell you how in 100 years. I believe it's now arrived for academia, where I don't believe that most chancellors are sitting out there, maniacally going, I'm going to create an incredibly complex environment where nobody can act either without the approval of every 19-year-old and my corporate sponsors and the pressure groups that are operating, right? But some of them can't show us how they prevent it. So then we start asking ourselves, if I look at the net, one of the great things about Sarbanes-Oxley and private industry is you get to the end, and as a former auditor, there's a week around the Super Bowl where you drive numbers under all the lines and go, I've got the number. And I could show you how I got that. And there's a reason I mentioned that. If I look at a university and pick one and go, can I show the societal impact, the positive value, the independent research, the advancements, the best use of resources towards that end? Is there ever a ledger I can sit down with and go, even if it's wrong, this is how I got there? I believe there'll be a sweep through academics where they're going to have to show it. And I believe it'll be the government that does it. And it's because these aren't private academic institutions. These are government-sponsored academic institutions pretending to be private institutions.
Yeah.
If all governmental funding of all forms of academia disappeared to the level that it was, say, in the 1950s, right? Or even worse, if you took out the GI Bill in the 1950s, so that literally the only people who went were sent by mom and dad. And I don't know what the number of university closures would be, but I would go into the building business because you would literally have so many to buy. And I believe that the government is going to start saying, particularly at the state level, hey, you're in my state, you're operating here. You get, first of all, this comes up all the time. I live in Boston. If you're not aware, property taxes don't apply to universities in Boston. Our two biggest industries are hospitals and universities. So this is non-trivial, right? We're updoors in schools, and I love every one of them, and they're famously good, right? But you'll start having folks saying, like, why would I do that? Why would I, by net effect, hamper my school system to sponsor you to run a university that's doing research on why elephants dance on parade, as opposed to, we have some, to speak to the good side, to the ones who would win in this, we have some wonderful groups like Berkeley who are working on auditory issues, right? And it's like, again, there's a huge societal value in that. And I don't care if you value auditory capabilities or autism research more than you value elephants dancing in a circle, but someone somewhere is going to have to sit down with these universities and go, here's my ledger. Now, interestingly, when you go to the start of this conversation, when we discussed how ESG and even DEI, if you went to a report for either any kind of organization, academic, social, or financial, you'd open it up, and very early on, right? Often, my favorite part is, depending on how bad the numbers are, was how quick you were reading about the social value of the organization, right? So like if profits were down, on page 2 would be like, let me tell you how we help the community. But they all have them in there. And as a pretty good accountant, I will tell you that what we'd all do when we go into these things, we'd rip them out of the way, we'd put our coffee cup on top of them, and we'd proceed to the numbers. Because we knew that they weren't telling the truth and that they didn't even care, and they knew we didn't care. If we created a system like Sarbanes-Oxley, where academia had to come forward each time and say, we've produced the following number of papers that have done it. When we look at Dana-Farber, We say, look, say what you want. We understand it's a complex thing, but they have several Nobel Prize winning developments in cancer research. That's a good report. When you get that as your academic report for that research group, you go, it's pretty good. When you go to some of these organizations, and one of the ones in Western Mass, where I did my undergraduate, Hampshire College, which has come close to closing. Why? Well, because literally there weren't classes all day long. There weren't majors. There weren't, so you start going, well, what am I doing besides being housed on a shelf? For a while, they were such a unique group that's why you went there. But there's too many of this. I believe that's going to connect the dots, that the government's going to come in and go, I'm not getting what I need out of you to these academic institutions at the top level. Right? I don't care about, because we all see the list every year. I'm one of the guys who reposts the list. This year, the government did a lot of research on duck penises. We all know that when we put that up there, we're really working around the fact that they're actually checking thyroids for drug developments, right? But if you sat there and said, I can tell you the value of British Petroleum. This I think, is a good example. This came out this week. And want to hear it or not, right now, we need petroleum. We need it badly. We need it to be available in duress times. And we need it for a price that doesn't drive inflation and starve people, right? Because there are real impacts. This fuel prices are up in Europe, and 100-year-old bakeries are closing. So I go, this is my Sarbanes-Oxley report about British Petroleum. This is the control system they have to make sure that they charge the right price, deliver the products, et cetera. Part of that process of British Petroleum has led them to, from what I read last week, I don't know how much truth there is to this, they said we're cutting 10% of our green energy staff, which must have been massive. I mean, BP this is just enormous beyond the minds of mortal men. So when they cut 10% of the green staff, it's huge.
Yeah.
Well, so when I turn to, say, an equal size university like Arizona State, one of these, anything above 25,000 students, my home university, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and go, give me a Sarbanes report on how you add value. BP has said, I get you fuel. I'm still working on green things, but I get you fuel. Yeah. And show me how the University of Massachusetts at Amherst meets its goals, or Arizona State. UMass Amherst was founded as a land grant college. In other words, it's supposed to advance agriculture. And they still do, right? But I can tell you as an alumni that while I'm very proud of it, it really has a great business school, et cetera, the number of animals actually walking around that campus these days is less than you would believe, and all of that. And that's okay if you come in and go, because I changed and I evolved it and I molded it. But it's not okay if it's like, we let the kids take over the school. Because when you look at BP's Sarbanes-Oxley report, it won't say we let the employees run the place. And we're hopeful for finding some oil someday. It might say, and while we're laughing, and the laughter's appropriate, I've read some of these prior reports. I was one of the first people who worked on Sarbanes-Oxley because I happened to be working in the audit department when it came out. And we read some of the reports and we were like, why would you ever possibly, right? Because I was in a company that did $20 billion in revenue a year, and it made $1 billion off of it, right? But it was incredibly complex to get to that $1 billion. And when you read inside the report and they'd say, one of the big changes we're making is, and we see this, they said we're going to try to reduce our paper usage to help the environment. I would sit there and go, first of all, that's really not going to impact the environment. It's kind of like Lego saying I'm going to use recycled plastic bottles. And second of all, why am I spending time on that? Is that your mission? Is that what you do? And I think we're going to see this dramatically. We are seeing it in diversity. We are seeing it in ESG, because a lot of the things that were done that were not delivering results in those categories, right? So really show me how you were improving the environment. Somebody at Lego, as a matter of fact, a lot of folks at Lego really put on their thinking hats. You can tell. It's a thoughtful organization. I truly admire it as a brand, and I've never gotten it as a client. I think one of the things we haven't gotten them as a client, one of the reasons is that they haven't gotten themselves into a whole lot of trouble. It's one of the reasons I really admire them, right? We have great clients. I love my clients, but they're regularly, the targets of massive movements. But one of the things you can really read in the environment that I'm comfortable with is this is a thoughtful group of passionate individuals who understand the sentiment of their organization. Yeah. Because we sit here and go, yeah, but it's very difficult to understand how people feel about the University of Massachusetts at Amherst or Arizona State. And I think to myself, well, And again, as a compliment to them, think about how much sentiment we have about people make a little plastic box that we put on top of each other and eventually make Chewbacca to sit on top of that, and there's a passion about it, right? And they can measure, I'm confident that they can measure and have a system to prove out how they stay there. I don't think a culture like that, and we do a lot of cultural work, I don't think a culture like that arises by accident. I believe you have to build a framework. I believe you have to measure it. I believe you have to build, monitor, and evaluate the controls to meet that objective. So if you really go, as BP clearly did, hey, for me to exist as British Petroleum, I've got to make a change towards green energy. I'm going to build a system that builds, monitor, and evaluates the controls to achieve that. You'll make progress. If you go, you know what's going to look great on the second page of the financial statements? A picture of me and 3 individuals standing by. Back before things got really intense, it would always be showing the employees cleaning up a park, right, or something sort of, completely harmless and also completely irrelevant toward that outcome.
Well, they're gonna have to figure it out, especially the colleges, because I mean, with the competitive set now. I mean, I worked for, I did some work for American Public University System. It's like, you go get your degree there and $1,000, a year. And it's all online and they're under heavy regulatory scrutiny, but that's going to shift towards like, hey, how come this university is charging $40,000 to $120,000? Like, where's the societal value? So I'm going to try to sum this up. It sounds like what you're saying is that there's a return to this idea of the corporate charter not being a given, where governments and other civil society organizations, they are thinking about what sort of societal value are you exchanging for your public license to operate. And if you're the CEO or on the board, how do you respond to that?
If everybody's responsible for producing that control environment, nobody is. Denote an individual and a team who ensure that you build, monitor, and evaluate the controls to meet that objective.
I love that. Paul Del Gallo from Firstsight Group. They are one of the premier market and non-market strategy organizations out there for people who really like to understand their environment and know what to do in it. As a reminder, we are sponsored by Quick Bright Men's Hair Cream and Wax. If it's not Quick Bright, it's not good. All right, I'm stopping the recording.
Thanks.